Hello and welcome to this short psychology topic video, this one looking at the Year 2 topic of gender for the AQA spec. Now in terms of this evening's webinar, we're going to look at a couple of things. We're going to go through the new specification in detail and look at the potential essay questions that can come up, and then from that look at the areas to watch out for based upon the old specification. And then to follow on from that, what we're going to do is look at some great ways to teach the gender topic, and there's 4 activities that we've put together for you today, and all of these activities have been designed to overcome some of the issues that students have historically faced when sort of taking part in this topic. So in terms of an overview of the specification, it's broken down into 6 different parts. The first topic is sex and gender, and actually what's nice about the new specification is that they're really specific with some of the key terms that the students need to know. So you've got sex role stereotypes, androgyny, and they've included again the BEM sex role inventory in this particular spec. You've then got the biological aspects, so you've got chromosomes and hormones as before, but they've named testosterone, estrogen and oxytocin this time. And then on top of that, still part of biology, you've got the atypical sex chromosome patterns, looking at Klinefelter syndrome and Turner syndrome. Moving on from that, you've got the different cognitive explanations, of which you need to focus on 2. So you've got Kohlberg's theory and gender schema theory. Then you've got the psychodynamic explanations, Freud's theory, in particular looking at the Oedipus complex, Electra complex, and then 2 key terms that students often miss, identification and internalisation. Going on from that, you've got social learning theory, and then last but not least, they've separated it out and you've got atypical gender development as its own sort of separate topic there, okay? Now it's always useful to look at the sample assessment material, to look at the types of questions that have appeared in the different sample assessments. Now this is only a guide, so we can't sort of infer that these will occur in the real exam, but it's good to see the types of essays that have already come up. So there's 3 across the sample paper, and the different types of sort of tricky application questions that come up as well. On top of that, you've also got research method questions that can easily get embedded into the gender topic, and there's also in the 3rd sample assessment material a question based around inferential statistics to have a look out for as well. Now what we've done for you is we've sort of taken a list of all the different potential essay questions that could occur in this topic, and there seems to be around 18 across the sort of different topics, and we've taken those from Exam Pro, the textbooks and the sample assessment material, just so you've got a picture of what questions could be asked and the wording of the questions. If I'd like to draw your attention to one, there's an application essay topic in the social learning theory part of the specification that's quite tricky, so I would look out for that one if you want to test your students with a tricky application essay. Now, as I do with all these webinars, I think it's useful to sort of look back at the old specification using the mark schemes and the examiner's reports to work out where students have historically gone wrong in the past, because that can really inform our planning and our teaching so that we know what areas to avoid when it comes to teaching this time round. Now, the examiner commentary provides an insight into 4 different key areas that we're going to explore in this webinar. So the first one is the biological explanations of gender development. The second one is gender schema theory. The 3rd one, Freud's psychoanalytic explanations, and then last but not least, social influences. So we'll take each one of those in turn. So the first area is this biological explanations of gender development, and the question I'm really going to go to here is this one. So describe and evaluate biological explanations of gender development and refer to evidence in your answer for 16 marks. Now if we look at sort of what are the highlights from the exam in terms of knowledge and evaluation, so what are the things we can learn about the AO1 and the AO3 separately, the examiner said that in terms of the knowledge, students often lose focus and they state biological explanations of behaviour generally rather than the biological explanation of gender development, so they need to be a lot more specific. Students often make reference to key terms, biological key terms, but they don't again apply them to the development of gender, and that's really, really key. The problem in this topic is students may think they know a lot about things like estrogen, testosterone typically, but they then don't apply that to actually what it is to be masculine or what it is to be feminine. In terms of the evaluation, in this topic in particular, students are often locked into a very simplistic understanding that the explanations don't overlap. So they'll often say the biological approach ignores or the social approach ignores, when actually most of the approaches in gender actually do acknowledge the other areas of the specification. So students really need to be thinking in sort of a more interactionist way when it comes to the gender topic. On top of that, as always, students found to elaborate on how or why the evidence they used could support a particular explanation when it comes to the biological explanations. So if we were to bullet point that down, what can we learn from the examiner's reports in this topic? The first thing is that students need to link the biological explanations, whether it's genes, hormones or atypical sex chromosomes, to gender development. Secondly, students need to correctly use specialist terminology and make sure it's applied. In terms of the evaluation, students need to appreciate a much more interactionist approach in this topic. And then last but not least, students need to practice elaborating their evaluation by stating how or why research provides support for that particular evaluation. Okay. That brings us nicely onto our first activity, which we've just called Spot the Biological Mistakes. And the aim of this activity is twofold. It's to help students really become more confident when selecting and using specialist terminology, but probably more importantly to understand how to link their biological knowledge to the question. Okay. And the way this activity starts is you provide your students with 2 paragraphs and you say that the paragraphs are answering this question, so describe and evaluate biological explanations, but unfortunately there are 10 key mistakes within it. So the first task of the student really simply is to sort of circle, underline, highlight the mistakes, probably avoid highlighting because you're going to use highlighting in the next part. So circle the mistakes and correct them, of which there's 10. What you then want them to do is to start to appreciate just how many times they're going to mention gender and gender behaviours, and get them to start to highlight in the answer where the answer in these 2 paragraphs has actually been applied back to the question. And what you'll see here in the first paragraph, there's a couple of cases straight away where the answer's been applied. Of course, you then want to provide your students with an opportunity to practice it by themselves, and I actually personally think that the atypical sex chromosomes make a really nice way to answer this question. So whether the students choose to write about genes or hormones is also fine, but I think it's much easier in this question to talk about how Klinefelter syndrome and Turner's syndrome actually affect gender development. And the idea is you want your students to write their own answer this time, but trying to make sure they're applying it back to the idea of what it is to be masculine, what it is to be feminine, and so forth. So just a little task to help your students overcome those issues. Moving on, if we look at the second of our key questions, this one is describe and evaluate gender schema theory of gender development. Again, a 16 mark answer, and I've put sort of a little diagram that I used with my students previously just to get them to remember the different stages of gender schema theory. Again though, if we think about what we can learn in terms of the exam, in terms of knowledge and the evaluation, really interestingly here, the examiners said that there's often a confusion between Kohlberg's theory, which is also named in the specification, and gender schema theory. So it's really important when teaching these topics that we do keep them distinct from one another. In terms of the evaluation, students often, and they're right to do so, they often use the biological model of gender development to actually evaluate, and that can be done very, very effectively. So there's nothing to stop students, once they've learned more than one topic in gender, to use the different theories to evaluate a second theory. However, unfortunately, when students do this, they often become diverted, and you see this a lot in gender. The case study of David Reimer comes up all the time. And what students often do is they become diverted into these dramatic case studies of gender reassignment, and then they fail to actually link that back to the question, and that's really, really key. So again, in terms of what we can learn, if we're going to bullet point that, students obviously need to understand explicitly gender schema theory by Martin and Halverson. They need to know how they can evaluate research, and they can do that in many different ways, but they need to know what evidence they can use. I've named a couple of studies here on the screen that are taken from the mark scheme, so you may want to play safe and use those. But students can also use the biological explanations, but what they must be good at is linking back their material to the question. And it's that final point that I've put in bold that really leads us on to our next activity, and a technique at Tutor to You that we're calling signposting, which is a common name for it. So the examiner's report suggests that students often struggle with linking research examining gender schema theory back to the question. And therefore the real goal of this activity is to help students understand a technique whereby they can explicitly link their answer back to the question. Now the way this works is you tell your students to again imagine that they're answering this question, so describe and evaluate gender schema theory of gender development. And then you provide them with 4 different studies of evidence, and you've got these on the handouts which you can download afterwards. So you've got 2 studies by Martin and Halverson, study by Martin and Little, and then a study by Bradbard. Now, because students struggle with this, I think it's actually really, really important to actually model your expectations the first time you teach them. So you might actually model an answer for them. So you might take one of those and you might say that one study that supports gender schema theory, in particular the idea of schema-related behaviour, was conducted by Martin and Halverson. They then bring in their evidence from that, which I've actually given them on the handout. So Martin and Halverson found that when children were shown schema-consistent pictures, for example, a girl playing with a doll, or schema-inconsistent pictures, a girl playing with a gun, when asked to recall, the children often distorted the information and actually reported back schema-consistent images all the time. So they might say it was actually a boy playing with a gun when it was in fact a girl. What you then want your students to do is obviously link that. So this supports the gender schema theory of gender development, as it shows that gender behaviour can be explained in terms of schema-related distorted memories that in turn shape our gender development and memory in line with in-group schemas. Now the students might be very good at that, but what you want them to really do is to highlight in their answer, and I've done that on screen for you now, where that answer has actually been applied back to the question, because if you could model one answer with them, that then gives them the tools and the framework to going forward to do it for the other three examples. The handout then provides this space for the other studies so that they can go ahead and actually write their own answers to the other three studies, the other study by Martin and Halverson, the Martin and Little study and the Bradbard study, just to get them really practicing signposting their evaluation back to the question. And that brings us on to our third of four techniques we're going to look at. So this question we're going to focus on now is the psychoanalytic explanation. So describe and evaluate Freud's psychoanalytic explanation of gender development. Again, 16 marks, of course. And in terms of this question, again, if we look at separately the knowledge and evaluation, the examiner said that some essays included lots of irrelevant details about the psychosexual stages of development, other than the phallic stage. And on top of that, there was often no reference to unconscious processes. Now, I think this is actually quite a hard essay to write because there's so much information surrounding Freud, and therefore it's really important that you get your students to become selective in terms of picking out the information that's really, really important in the question. The examiners also said it's rare to see identification mentioned, and even rarer for students to actually use the word internalisation. And given that the examiners have commented on that, we therefore really want our students to be explicit in using those terms, okay? If we look at evaluation, and this is common not just in this topic but others as well, evaluation points are often these long lists of things like problems with Freud, is that it lacks scientific explanation, or it lacks generalisability, falsifiability, but again the students are just not linking those points back. So again, if we just bullet point what we can learn, while the features of the psychodynamic approach might include all of the psychosexual stages, what you want your students to focus their attention on, of course, is the phallic stage, in particular the idea of the Oedipus and the Electra complexes. On top of that, if we really want to make sure our students are aiming for that top mark band, we want them to be using definitely the terms unconscious process, identification and internalisation in their answers. Finally, in terms of evaluation, as always, it goes without saying, it needs to be developed and it needs to be linked back to the question. So that brings us nicely onto activity 3, which we call Don't Make a Freudian Slip. And the aim of this task is really to consolidate your students' knowledge of the key Freudian terms and get them to practice writing a concise summary of Freud's theory, which, to be honest, is something that I even struggle with. It's very, very hard to condense an AO1 section of Freud down to this sort of 150, 170 words mark. Now, the way this activity works is actually we've provided an explanation of Freud's gender development theory, the different aspects of his theory taken from our Tutor to You course companion. And the first bit really is the easy task. The students just have to select the correct key terms in relation to each section that go into the answer. And we've actually broken it into 4 parts. So we've got Freud's psychoanalytic theory, the Oedipus complex, which you can see on screen now. On the second page of the handout, they've got the Electra complex, and then they've got identification and internalisation. That's the first part, and you might want to check the students have got the correct answers before progressing on to part 2. The second part of the activity, I would say, is the most important part, because the summary that we've provided you is over 500 words long and is therefore too much to write. That's almost an entire essay, but it's certainly too much to write for just the AO1 section of an answer. So what you want to do is to tell your students, get them to imagine that they're answering this evaluation question, this describe and evaluate Freud's psychoanalytic explanation, and get them to condense down those 4 paragraphs, which are 500 words, to approximately 125, 175 words. Very, very difficult task, but it can be done, and that's the challenge for your students. If you want to make the task even harder, you get them to do it within the sort of within the 5 to 6 minute time frame, which is realistically all they're going to have in the exam as well. So you can be really harsh with this task. Last but not least, the final question I want to focus our attention on is discuss the importance of social influences on gender. Again, a 16 marker, and it's really just knowledge points to pick out here, because the examiner said that a common error was that students simply provide evidence for the effects of social influences. But what they've done in this question is they've not focused their attention to the bit I've underlined on the screen. They've not said which of the different explanations are the most, or in some cases the least important or the least significant. And it all comes back to that, getting your student to actually answer the question that's on the screen or the page, not the answer they want to be on the page. So in terms of what we can learn, relevant social influences would include culture, media, and even social learning theory. And that students need to focus their answer and link the discussion and evaluation to the importance of the different social issues. So they're not simply just evaluating, they're actually linking their evaluation to which of these points is more or less important. And that brings us sort of onto our final activity, which actually we've called applying social learning theory to gender development. Now, social learning theory occurs in both Year 1 and many Year 2 optional units. And there's a danger around that, because the problem with social learning theory is that the students tend to know it very, very well, and therefore they forget to apply it to the relevant topic. Now, the aim of this task is to help students overcome that issue by explicitly sort of applying their knowledge of social learning theory to the topic of gender by using sort of everyday examples. Now, the way the activity works is we provided a nice sort of 150, 200 word outline of social learning theory. But what we've not done is actually really apply it properly to gender. And the way that the activity works is you'll see there's numbers on the screen with asterisks, and there's a table underneath the handout whereby the students have to, every time they encounter a number and an asterisk, they have to put in there an everyday example linked to gender development. So we've done that, we've provided some examples for you, but just to give you a sort of flavour of that, this paragraph here says children can also learn vicariously through indirect reinforcement. By watching what happens in situations around them, children learn to what is acceptable and what is unacceptable based on what happens to others. For example, and this is where you want your students to come up with an example, I've put, if a little boy sees his friend being praised for not crying when he falls over, he may think twice before crying in the same situation. And if a little girl sees her friend being told off for being too boisterous, she may choose to manage her behaviour for fear of being punished. And you can see we've just applied some nice everyday examples to that. You can get your students to take it even further and make sure they're bringing in the actual key terms from the theory, from operant conditioning as well. But it's just a nice activity to sort of train your students in a way to be applying their knowledge of the theory to the question in hand. And there we have it. So that brings us to the end of this agenda webinar. We hope you found that useful, and sort of some of the activities might be ones that you use in lessons and try them out. Of course, if you've got any questions or queries, don't hesitate to get in contact via the Facebook group, via Twitter, or if need be, do drop me an email directly, and we'll always do our best to sort of answer you and provide support where we can. Thanks very much again. Bye-bye.